BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Today we're revisiting the case of the Zodiac Killer, and I knew that I wanted to say some things about Hal Snook, who is a suspect, as well as the prime suspect in the orchestration of the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. And I was planning on doing more of a profiling upload about Hal Snook. Then as I began to evaluate the information, I noticed that, wait a second, this is probably going to be 2 uploads. Notice that this is listed as part 1. Then, as I was going through things more and more, it almost seems like it's going to be even more than that. So we're going to have a couple uploads coming up on Hal Snook and the Zodiac Killer. And then we're going to be looking at some things about Don Hardin as a Zodiac Killer suspect later on. The reason why I said that there's going to be a series of uploads coming out about Hal Snook is it's not so much about time constraints as it is rather the themes, the topics, examining the situation from different angles. And I felt if I was going to do something about like a personal profile of Hal Snook, I could only do that if I first heard something from Thomas Henry Horan, who is the largest proponent of the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, author of the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. I've messaged him from time to time, and I really didn't want to pester him too much, but I just asked him a simple question. I was like, if I'm going to do this, I really need his input. I asked him a simple question, like, how would you describe Hal Snook's personality? And he wrote me a book-length answer. I mean, I'm genuinely impressed. If I were to read off the entire thing that he had written for me, it would take more than 20 minutes. Very, very, very generous response. And I should say, first and foremost, of course, we're dealing with the Zodiac Killer murders. 1968 to 1969 is the bulk of Zodiac activity. If we start with the first confirmed incident, December 20th, 1968 at Lake Herman Road, we saw the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Note that has an enormous amount of proximity to the winter solstice. And then Blue Rock Springs, of course, happened on July 5th of 1969, which saw the murder of Darlene Fair and the shooting of Mike Michaud, who survived that. Then we have the stabbing at Lake Berryessa, which saw the murder of Cecilia Ann Shepard, who passed away 2 days later in the hospital, as well as the surviving individual, Brian Hartnell, who survived the stabbing. Once again, Lake Berryessa, September 27th, 1969. And 2 weeks after that, more or less, Paul Stein was murdered in Presidio Heights on October 11th of 1969. And then everything else before or after that is in the category of unconfirmed Zodiac activity. How does this individual named Hal Snook fit into any of these angles? Well, one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to expand upon a previous upload that we did talking about the Zodiac Killer psychological profile. We did one upload recently where I was talking about some of the claims that was mentioned by an individual named Dr. Todd Grande. He did a psychological profile video on the Zodiac Killer, saying that the Zodiac was someone who was most likely very low in neuroticism, not worrying a lot. But at the same time, he's also someone who's very insecure and needs constant rewards, notoriety, and attention, and so on. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to ask Thomas Henry Horan about. So, how would any of this possibly apply to Hal Snook? And as I said, though, got a very big response here. And Thomas Horan has done something very similar. Just to look at what he has written me here, this is the message that he has sent in regards to the psychological profile of Hal Snook. He met with a psychologist and says, there are 2 big possibilities about Hal Snook. Number 1, he could be a gifted underachiever who blamed others, like the quote-unquote system, for his failure to achieve. Or, number 2, he could be a plain old sociopath. Because when I was talking with Drew Beeson about the Zodiac Killer, we recently interviewed him on the channel. We've also interviewed Thomas Horan in the past. And I'd highly recommend you guys check out those interview uploads if you haven't heard them previously. But one of the things that we were saying is, for the Zodiac Killer hoax theory to function, you would need somebody who is writing letters, taking credit for some murders that they didn't commit. Particularly Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, the first 2 incidents in Zodiac activity. After that happened, then you would have someone, well, taking credit for murders that were somewhat orchestrated, so it would appear. It really appears that the Zodiac hoax took on a life of its own after Blue Rock Springs and became a real Zodiac Killer mystery. That's just my response to it, mind you. We've talked about this in several uploads. So the thing to say is, what kind of person would allow Cecilia Shepard to be murdered? And what kind of person would allow Paul Stine to be murdered? Of course, we also saw the stabbing of Brian Hartnell, but he survived. What kind of person would do that if it's just to perpetrate the hoax? I mean, what are the motivations for the hoax? Hal Snook is bitter about not getting his World War II medals, possibly connections to the drug trade, possibly connections to the Manson family, I mean, and some of their activities, connections to the CIA. What kind of person would want to have real people murdered, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stine, just so they could perpetrate this Zodiac Killer hoax? Well, if Hal Snook is a plain old sociopath, that is something else that we could say. I mean, then he probably wouldn't care too much about that. And it also could mean he was deeper in some type of web of activities that we don't necessarily know about. I do have to insist with the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. I mean, at first, someone's writing letters, taking credit for the murders at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. The prime suspect in Horan's hoax theory for the Lake Berryessa stabbing is an individual named Dennis Land. But I said we had a lot of material to cover. Maybe we'll see about how some other people could be the perpetrator in the Lake Berryessa stabbing. There are other suspects. And then it's possible that Hal Snook himself even committed the murder of Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969. But let's read a little bit more about Hal Snook from what Thomas Horan has given me. He was certainly highly intelligent, able to teach himself an amazing variety of things. In his retirement, Hal collected fossils and other interesting rocks for sale to collectors. I once owned his Jurassic fish fossils, but he was definitely an underachiever. Okay, first of all, he might have been a sociopath, but this sounds like a very gentle individual, collecting fish fossils and all that, but I guess there are sociopathy can take many forms. Like a lot of talented people from humble backgrounds and small farm communities, Snook chafed at the necessity of rising through the ranks of anything. He preferred to start at the top. And what Thomas Horan told me during our interview on this channel is Hal had to be a big fish in a small pond. And that kind of goes along with what he's saying there, never wanting to rise in the ranks. And that's why I thought that the claim that you're dealing with a person who's low in neuroticism, but high in insecurity, matched up with Hal Snook, who is the prime suspect in Horan's hoax theory for writing the original Zodiac Killer letters. And also, let's, like I said, this is a very, very big set of info that he has given me, so we're going to jump ahead to some more of the personality things we have written here. These are Horan's words. He was known as being vain, aloof, and distant. He was smarter than everyone else, and he made sure they knew it. He did not socialize with other cops. And yes, Hal Snook would go on to work for the Napa County Narcotics Division, I believe. His friends were musicians and sketchy journalists like Pat Stanley, with whom he schemed in politics and real estate, and the same thing in Napa. Some of his friends were reported to be satanists, and Hal would often drop hints that he knew spooks in the CIA. And he apparently did know a couple, and other weird associations. Okay, about that. The CIA is definitely going to be involved with something like this, and I would say, though, if for Horan's hoax theory to work, you would probably have to list Hal Snook as a CIA informant. And Tom O'Neill, the author of the book Chaos about the Manson family and the Tate LaBianca murders, is very keen to offer us the definition of an informant, just meaning somebody who is having any sort of connection at all to the CIA would be an informant. Not necessarily someone who is completely pulled in, someone who's a CIA operative undercover. Not necessarily. It's actually possible that Hal Snook could have just been sending coded messages involving the drug trade to an individual named Tony Poe in Southeast Asia. But I really have to confess, though, think about everything that we said. It's possible that Hal Snook committed the murder of Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969. I mean, like, Horan is quite clear about that. It's not 100% certain that he murdered Paul Stine, mind you, but he does view him as a suspect in that. And it's like, once again, talking about, like, the psychology of this all, who would go to such great efforts just to send some messages involving the drug trade? How is this really, like, where's all this going? Well, it's possible that the CIA was much more heavily embedded in the situation than we originally expected. Or, as we heard here, Hal Snook could be a complete sociopath, just reading off some of these things here. And let's see some other things that are in this message. For years, I've held out hope that Hal, since he's no longer around to defend himself, may have had a more or less noble motive in writing the letters, exposing police corruption. The funny thing is, his journalism buddies, Pat Stanley and others, were slapped pretty hard for publishing outright fake news, fake stories about Napa corruption. They were corrupt, but the specific articles were pure fiction during an election year. Chronic job hopping, vanity, and aloofness alone doesn't prove that someone is a sociopath, but they can be symptoms. So I asked the shrink, who was satisfied with my work showing the Zodiac letters were a hoax of some kind, and not necessarily a confession to actual murder. Based on what we do know, would you say Hal was narcissistic, an underachiever, or a sociopath? She said, murderer or not, even if he did have a good reason for writing those letters, the casual disregard he shows for the feelings of the victims and their families, and the reader he terrorizes with his threats, strongly suggests a sociopath. And that's another thing that I was thinking about. Like, one of the things that perhaps I said previously on the channel was, all right, if you have a Zodiac Killer hoax theory, and I am open to other possibilities, I don't endorse it 100%, but we're talking about Hal Snook and his alleged possible involvement in all this. One of the things I said was, writing letters, taking credit for other murders that someone else committed is not the most evil thing in the world. No. But is it evil? Absolutely yes. I mean, think about the families of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen and Darlene Ferrin. They aren't getting their closure, let alone all the people that are reading about the Zodiac Killer in the San Francisco papers and learning about the Zodiac and this legend that they talked about on America's Most Wanted that I heard as a kid. He terrorized the Bay Area. Definitely, that does sound like you would perhaps have a lot of sociopathic tendencies. And Thomas Horan then went on to ask the psychologist, do you think he'd be capable of murdering strangers in cold blood? She said, if he was that type, then that's the type who most frequently commits those kind of murders. So then, once again, that ties into the murder of Paul Stine. And in the next part, we're going to look at some possible involvement in Hal Snook's role in this. Like, maybe he's involved with more than just the letter writing of the Zodiac Killer. She said that he could be the type that commits those murders. I have no doubt that whatsoever the person who wrote those letters often fantasized intensely and compulsively about committing the murders he wrote about and threatened to commit whether he did them or not. Meaning that you got someone, who is putting a lot of thought into this, really imagining and visualizing the action of murdering people, if it is indeed the Zodiac hoax theory. Or you could just simply say that the person writing the letters, I like killing because it's so much fun, that these people are going to be reborn in paradise and be my slaves. Or the taunts of the police, taunting people, saying that you need to publish these letters and articles. Really, it's the ciphers that needed to be on the front page. And that's a whole different kettle of fish in terms of motivation. When you want to look at the CIA angle, I mean, some of the claims involved with this, involving Hal Snook and his possible connections to the CIA, saying that he knows people in the CIA. Once again, he's not like a CIA operative, as I understand. One of the motivations could simply be that it was the go signal and the stop signal for the Manson family to launch their criminal activities, tying it into Helter Skelter, that the 408 cipher was the go signal, the 340 cipher was the stop signal, when these things were published in the papers. That could be something. And I heard him say that on the Stones Unturned recently, and I'm not saying that he's wrong. I am not. All I would say about that is I need some time to digest it. That the reason why the Zodiac wanted these ciphers published on the front page of the papers was a go signal and a stop signal for the Manson family and their activities, or even to send that to Southeast Asia, to Tony Poe, that it's any type of marker at all about some activity involving the narcotics trade. Once again, I definitely would not say that he was wrong about any of that stuff. It's just that I need some time to look more into the subject before I could even wrap my head around that, because let's not kid ourselves. The CIA does some crazy things, and we're going to hear a lot more about them later this week. But what I can say is, it's just that it's not easy to completely accept a theory like that. And one of the things that Thomas Horan also would like us to know is that he has questioned Hal Snook's family about him, or tried to contact them, and he says they all refuse to talk about him. His family never talks about him at all. He does strongly resemble the composite sketch in the Stein shooting, and that murder was by far the best organized of the Zodiac murders. The perpetrator demonstrated some considerable knowledge of police investigation techniques and was very cool under fire, and treated the corpse like an object with no emotional value at all. And he looked an awful lot like Hal. Well, as far as that goes, I mean, you got some bold things there. And one of the things that was, I'm sure it's from Thomas Horan, but I heard about it in the video from Evan from Texas, was when he was saying that there could be so many different things that are going on in the Zodiac Killer mystery to show that the Zodiac Killer had a connection to law enforcement, no matter who it is, Hal Snook or not Hal Snook, that the Zodiac Killer was familiar with the tactics of law enforcement, even the handwriting in the letters, the way it tilts to one side, and some letters could be written upside down just using very common handwriting techniques to disguise the handwriting so blatantly that the handwriting expert would be like, this person is using all the textbook handwriting techniques to disguise their handwriting. Maybe we're dealing with a police officer. Maybe we're dealing with a forensic scientist. We can say that Hal Snook definitely had knowledge of chemistry. I mean, because from his work in the narcotics division, he almost certainly would have had a heavy knowledge of mathematics, which comes into play later on. But like I said, though, this is part one, and in part two, we're going to look at some different angles in this. We actually want to just explore the possibility of whether or not Hal Snook committed additional murders. I mean, like as Horan wrote here, and I read off to you guys, Horan views him as a suspect in the murder of Paul Stein. However, let's look at the possibility that Hal Snook perhaps could have had a greater involvement in this. That's why I knew that it's going to be a multi-part discussion things. So if you're listening to these live, you'll see that this is part one. We're going to have part two coming out later on. As far as the Zodiac Killer hoax theory goes, I would say that it is a little bit complicated. And perhaps you will have multiple people going on, all sort of things connected to perhaps a shadow network of cult-like activities. And you heard that thing in there about how Snook claims to have known people who were satanic. What I can say is, what it seems like that was going on in 1969, and I wasn't alive then, but we do have these things about Aleister Crowley, Anton LaVey, and it actually seems like they were much more benign activities than what we would think about normally when we think about the Church of Satan. Earl Van Best was actually the piano player and the organist with Anton LaVey for a period of time. We talked about that during our book discussion on The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart. So it's like, we do have this possibility that those connections could be a little bit more benign. And, I mean, it really is a shame that Hal Snook is not still alive, so we can't just, either have someone interrogate him, get his responses to these things, and his family doesn't seem to talk about him, but that can go both ways. You could also view that as someone who does not seem to have 100% certainty that he had any involvement with this, because let's face it, not all suspects can work out. It can't be all of the people on the suspect list. And let's just look at a few different possibilities. So as time goes by, let's look out for a couple more Zodiac Killer uploads. And I said we're going to have a few coming out about Hal Snook, and we can see some of the things that we have to say. I really wanted to focus this one on Horan's notes and have a little bit of a discussion about them, because it would be unfair to talk about Hal Snook as a Zodiac Killer suspect, as well as the writer of the letters, orchestrator of the hoax theory, any involvement of this all without hearing from him. So big thank you to Thomas Henry Horan for writing those notes out. And I will see you guys in part 2. Please look out for that on the channel, and until next time.